6 weeks into maternity leave, still healing from an emergency C-section, running on almost no sleep, I drove to the restaurant my grandmother founded in 1974 to drop off a highchair we no longer needed, and my keycard didn't work. I stood at the back door of Nana Lucia's, the restaurant I had co-owned with my brother for 9 years, holding my 6-week-old daughter in her car seat, pressing a keycard against a reader that used to beep green every single time, watching it flash red over and over, while my brother's business partner, a man I barely knew named Victor Salcido, opened the door from the inside and told me with a tight, uncomfortable smile that he'd need to check with Anthony before letting me in. Anthony is my brother. I had co-owned that restaurant with him, 50-50, for 9 years. It took me 11 days to find out that 4 weeks into my maternity leave, while I was recovering from surgery and learning how to keep a newborn alive on 3 hours of sleep. My brother had filed an amended LLC operating agreement with the state of Illinois, using a signature purporting to be mine, reducing my ownership stake from 50% to 5%, and removing me entirely as a managing member with any authority over the business our grandmother spent her entire life building. If you're new here, welcome to Family Hidden Fight, where we tell you the truth about the wars fought behind closed doors, inside families, sometimes while one half of the family is too exhausted and vulnerable to even know the fight has started. Today's story is called The Locks They Changed While I Was on Leave. Let's begin. My name is Gabriella Marchetti. I'm 34 years old, and I co-owned, until 11 months ago, a restaurant in Chicago's Bucktown neighborhood called Nana Lucia's, a name that belonged to my actual grandmother, Lucia Marchetti, who emigrated from Sicily in 1968 and opened the restaurant 6 years later with money she'd saved working double shifts as a seamstress, determined to build something in this country that would outlast her. She succeeded. Nana Lucia's became, over 5 decades, a genuine neighborhood institution, the kind of place with regulars who'd been coming since they were kids, the kind of place that got written up in every Chicago food guide, the kind of place my grandmother ran with an iron will and a warmth that somehow coexisted in the same small, formidable woman, until she finally, reluctantly, semi-retired at 79, handing day-to-day operational control to me and my older brother, Anthony. In a carefully structured transition that took nearly 2 years to complete, the ownership structure my grandmother established, with the help of a business attorney she trusted completely, split the restaurant's LLC 50-50 between Anthony and me, with a clear operating agreement specifying that any major decision, significant financial commitments, changes to ownership structure, hearing or firing key management, required agreement from both of us. My grandmother, in the last conversation we ever had about the restaurant's future, before a stroke 3 years ago left her unable to speak clearly and eventually took her life a year later, told me, with the specific intensity she brought to everything that mattered to her, "You and your brother together always. Never one without the other. That is the only way this place survives." I believed that completely. I had worked at Nana Lucia's since I was old enough to bus tables, had earned a degree in hospitality management specifically to bring professional expertise back to the family business, had spent 9 years, alongside Anthony, building the restaurant into something that regularly turned a genuine, meaningful profit, expanding the private event space, modernizing the kitchen, building a social media presence that brought in a whole new generation of regulars alongside the loyal, long-time customers who remembered my grandmother personally. I never once, in 9 years of partnership with my brother, imagined a version of this story where he would try to take it all away from me the moment I was too physically and emotionally depleted to notice. I gave birth to my daughter, Sophia, 5 weeks early, following complications that required an emergency C-section. A difficult, frightening delivery that left me recovering from major abdominal surgery while simultaneously navigating the exhausting, disorienting first weeks of new motherhood, made harder by Sophia's own early arrival requiring a brief stay in the NICU before we could bring her home. I want to describe, honestly, what those first 6 weeks actually looked like, because I think it matters enormously to understanding exactly how something this significant could happen without me noticing for as long as it did. I was not simply tired, in the ordinary way new parents describe being tired. I was recovering from major surgery, running on broken 2-hour stretches of sleep, managing a newborn who, due to her early arrival, needed more frequent feeding and monitoring than a full-term baby typically would. And processing, alongside all of that, the specific, disorienting anxiety that comes with a difficult, frightening delivery. My husband, Marco, a firefighter working a demanding shift schedule, was doing everything he could to support me. But the reality of those 6 weeks was that I had almost no meaningful bandwidth left over for anything beyond keeping myself and my daughter alive and functioning. I had, before going on leave, agreed with Anthony that he would handle day-to-day restaurant operations during my absence, with the understanding, explicit and clearly discussed between us in the weeks before Sophia's early arrival forced my leave to begin sooner than planned, that any major decisions would still require my involvement, even remotely, even if that just meant a phone call or a text message rather than an in-person conversation. I checked in during those first weeks, far less than I would have under ordinary circumstances. A handful of brief texts with Anthony, mostly logistical, mostly initiated by him with simple operational updates that gave me no reason to suspect anything unusual was happening. I trusted him completely. He was my brother. We had built this together, alongside each other, for 9 years. The day I stood at that back door, holding Sophia's car seat, watching my keycard flash red, I initially assumed some kind of ordinary technical malfunction, a system update, a battery issue with the reader, something mundane and easily resolved. Victor Salcido's discomfort when he opened the door and told me he'd need to check with Anthony was the first genuine crack in that assumption. Victor was someone Anthony had brought on, roughly a year earlier, in a consulting capacity related to the restaurant's expansion into catering and private events. Someone I knew only casually, someone who had no obvious reason to be gatekeeping my own access to a restaurant I co-owned. "Victor, I own half of this restaurant," I told him, standing at the back door with a 6-week-old baby, exhaustion and confusion rapidly curdling into something sharper. "I don't need anyone's permission to walk into my own business." Victor's expression, in that moment, told me considerably more than his careful, hedging words did. "I really think you should talk to Anthony," he said again, and stepped back inside, closing the door most of the way, leaving me standing on the loading dock with my daughter, genuinely uncertain, for the first time in 9 years, whether I was actually still welcome in the restaurant my own grandmother had built. I called Anthony immediately. He didn't answer. I called 3 more times over the following hour. He didn't answer any of them. I drove home that day with Sophia, still strapped into her car seat, the highchair still in my trunk, unable to fully process what had just happened, alternating between a specific, cold fear and a stubborn, exhausted insistence that there had to be some explanation, some misunderstanding, that would resolve itself the moment Anthony finally called me back. He called me back 4 days later. "Been meaning to call you," Anthony said, when he finally called, his tone carrying an odd, forced casualness that immediately put me on edge. "There's some stuff we need to talk about with the business. I think it's better if we set up a proper meeting instead of trying to hash it out over the phone." "Anthony, why couldn't I get into the restaurant?" I asked, my voice tighter than I intended, 4 days of unanswered calls having stripped away whatever patience I'd initially tried to extend him. There was a pause, long enough that I understood, even before he spoke, that whatever came next was going to be considerably worse than a simple technical misunderstanding. We restructured some things while you were out, he said. Nothing that changes the big picture. But I brought Victor on as a more formal partner to help manage the catering expansion, and we adjusted the ownership percentages a little to reflect that. I was going to walk you through all of it once you were more settled with the baby. I didn't want to overwhelm you with business stuff this early. Adjusted the ownership percentages, I repeated, my heart pounding in a way that felt disconnected from the careful, measured tone I was trying to maintain. Whose ownership percentage, Anthony? Another pause. It's really better to talk through in person, Gabby. Whose ownership percentage? Mine went up a little. Victor's got a small stake now for what he's bringing to the catering side, and yours adjusted down slightly to reflect that you've been out of the day-to-day for a while now, he said, the words coming out faster now, almost defensive. It's not permanent, it's just reflecting the current reality of who's actually running things right now. I sat in my kitchen, Sophia asleep in a bassinet beside me, and understood with a clarity that cut through 6 weeks of exhausted fog exactly what my brother had just admitted to. I called an attorney the next morning, a business litigation and corporate law specialist in Chicago named Renata Alavi, referred to me through a friend from my hospitality management program whose own family had navigated an unrelated but similarly bitter business partnership dispute years earlier. Renata's first step was straightforward, pulling the current, publicly filed LLC operating agreement and any recent amendments from the Illinois Secretary of State's business filing system. What she found, within a single afternoon, confirmed the worst version of what Anthony's evasive phone call had suggested. An amended operating agreement had been filed 4 weeks into my maternity leave, 3 weeks before I'd even shown up at the restaurant with the highchair, restructuring the LLC's ownership from the original 50-50 split between Anthony and me into a new configuration. Anthony at 60%, Victor Salcido at 35%, and me reduced to a mere 5%, with the amendment's governance provisions explicitly removing me from any managing member authority, leaving Anthony and Victor as the sole individuals with legal decision-making power over the business. The amendment bore my signature, dated 4 weeks into my leave, a period during which I had been, according to my own phone records, and more damningly, my hospital discharge and follow-up appointment records, physically at home recovering from surgery, caring for a newborn, and critically, had never once, on that specific date, been anywhere near the restaurant, the attorney's office listed as having notarized the document, or any location where I could have plausibly signed anything. I didn't sign this, I told Renata, staring at the document on her office computer screen, my hands shaking. I was at a pediatrician follow-up appointment for Sophia that entire afternoon. I have the appointment confirmation. I have my husband's testimony that we were together the whole time. Then we have a very strong case, Renata said. But I want to be honest with you about the timeline pressure here, because the longer this amended agreement sits on file, unchallenged, the more entrenched Anthony and Victor's operational control becomes, and the more complicated it may become to unwind, particularly if they use that operational control to make significant financial decisions in the meantime that would be considerably harder to reverse once made. Renata moved quickly, given the timeline concerns, retaining a forensic document examiner named Walter Kessler, a name that, I'll admit, gave me a strange, disorienting sense of déjà vu, since it turned out to be a genuinely common enough profession that I'd later learned several other families in similarly urgent disputes had relied on similarly specialized experts, each building their own version of exactly this kind of case. Walter's analysis, comparing the signature on the amended operating agreement against multiple verified authentic samples of my signature, restaurant paychecks, my own personal banking records, a lease agreement I'd signed years earlier, found clear, structural inconsistencies consistent with forgery, including the absence of a small, distinctive loop I've unconsciously added to the capital G of my first name since childhood. A detail so automatic to my own handwriting that I hadn't consciously thought about it once until Walter pointed out its absence from the forged version. The notary listed on the amended agreement, a woman named Denise Falco, turned out, once Renata's investigator looked into her, to be a longtime friend of Victor Salcido's, someone with no independent professional relationship to Nana Lucia's or its ownership structure beyond whatever personal connection had made her willing to notarize a document without, as Walter's analysis strongly suggested, and as Denise would eventually admit under direct questioning. My actual presence, or genuine signature. Renata filed an emergency motion in Cook County Circuit Court seeking a temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction, both reinstating my original 50% ownership stake and managing member authority pending full litigation. And critically, preventing Anthony and Victor from making any further significant financial decisions, asset transfers, or operational changes to the business, while the underlying fraud allegations were being resolved. A request supported by Walter's preliminary forensic findings and my own sworn affidavit detailing the timeline, my medical records establishing my whereabouts on the date in question, and Marco's corroborating testimony. I want to walk you through what that legal filing actually meant, in practical terms, for a restaurant that, unlike some of the assets involved in prior stories I've told on this channel, was a living, operating business with employees, vendors, ongoing financial obligations, and a public-facing reputation that could be genuinely damaged by a prolonged, visible ownership dispute playing out in the middle of normal operations. The court, recognizing the urgency and the strength of the preliminary evidence, particularly the medical records establishing my clear, verifiable whereabouts on the date the forged signature was purportedly executed, granted a temporary restraining order within 8 days of Renata's filing, reinstating my full ownership rights and managing authority, and freezing any further significant financial transactions without my consent, pending a full evidentiary hearing. The temporary restraining order gave Renata's team the legal standing to demand a full accounting of the business's financial activity during the period Anthony and Victor had exercised unauthorized control, and what that accounting revealed complicated this story considerably beyond a simple, isolated act of forgery. In the roughly 7 weeks between the forged amendments filing and the restraining order taking effect, Anthony and Victor had transferred $180,000 out of the restaurant's operating account into a newly established business entity called Bucktown Hospitality Group LLC. A company registered, Renata's investigation revealed, by Victor, 3 weeks before the forged operating agreement was even filed, listing Anthony as a co-member. The stated purpose of the transfer, according to internal restaurant records Anthony and Victor had generated during their period of control, was to fund catering division expansion and equipment acquisition. But Renata's forensic accountant, a specialist named Priya Ramanathan, who I'd later learn had, coincidentally, worked with Daniel Whitcomb, the forensic accountant from a similar case I'd read about on this very channel, found no evidence that the transferred funds had actually been used to purchase any catering equipment, hire any additional catering staff, or fund any of the specific expansion activities described in the internal justification documents. Instead, Priya's investigation traced roughly $95,000 of the transferred funds to a down payment on a separate commercial property in the West Loop neighborhood, purchased in the name of Bucktown Hospitality Group LLC, a property that, based on real estate listings Priya located, Anthony and Victor appeared to be positioning as the future location of an entirely separate restaurant concept, one that would operate independently of Nana Lucia's, and notably, would not include me as any kind of owner or stakeholder whatsoever. I sat with Renata and Priya, reviewing these findings, and understood, with a specific, cold clarity, exactly what my brother had actually been building toward, using the family restaurant our grandmother founded as, functionally, a funding source for an entirely separate venture he intended to launch. Using my share of a business I had spent 9 years helping build, while I was recovering from surgery and unable to notice what was happening. I confronted Anthony directly, roughly 10 weeks into this entire ordeal, at a coffee shop neither of us had any particular connection to, chosen specifically, at Renata's suggestion, as neutral ground away from the restaurant itself. Anthony looked, when I arrived, genuinely uncomfortable in a way that gave me, for one brief moment, some small hope that this conversation might produce something resembling honest accountability. "Know how this looks," he said, before I'd even fully sat down. "But you have to understand, Gabby, I've been the one actually running things day to day for years now, while you focused more on the marketing and events side. Victor came in with real capital and real expertise for the catering expansion, and I felt like I was constantly having to check every decision with you, even small operational stuff, and it was slowing everything down. I thought if I just handled the restructuring quietly, showed you the results once the catering division was actually generating real revenue, you'd see it made sense." "You forged my signature, Anthony," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. "That's not restructuring. That's fraud. And you did it while I was recovering from a C-section, unable to even walk without pain, taking care of a newborn who spent her first week in the NICU. You picked the exact moment I was least capable of noticing or defending myself." Anthony's discomfort at that specific accusation shifted into something closer to defensive anger. "I didn't plan the timing around your surgery," he said. "The catering opportunity with the West Loop space came up fast, and Victor needed a decision quickly. And honestly, Gabby, you weren't really available to make decisions during that period regardless of what was happening with the business. I made a call under pressure. Maybe it wasn't the right call procedurally, but I wasn't trying to exploit you being sick. I was trying to keep the business moving while you couldn't. Then why forge my signature instead of just calling me and asking?" I asked. "If it was really such an obviously good decision, why not just explain it to me and get my actual consent?" He didn't have a good answer for that question. He never did, throughout the rest of this entire ordeal, produce an answer for that specific question that held together under any real scrutiny. Because, as Renata pointed out to me afterward, there was no honest answer available to him. He hadn't asked because he knew, correctly, that I would have said no, and he had decided, in that moment, that taking what he wanted mattered more than respecting my actual ownership rights in a business we were supposed to be running together, exactly as our grandmother had insisted. The full evidentiary hearing on the fraud allegations and the underlying ownership dispute took place over 5 days in Cook County Circuit Court, roughly 7 months after the forged amendment was originally filed. Walter Kessler testified about his forensic handwriting analysis, walking the court through the specific structural inconsistencies distinguishing the forged signature from my genuine one, including the missing loop in my capital G that had, in his professional opinion, been the single most reliable indicator that the signature had been produced by someone attempting to replicate my handwriting rather than by me personally. My obstetrician's office produced records confirming Sophia's follow-up appointment on the exact date the amendment was purportedly signed, and my husband testified, in detail, about our whereabouts and activities that entire day, corroborating my own account with independent, contemporaneous evidence that made Anthony's position considerably harder to sustain. Denise Falco, the notary, testified, under subpoena and with visible discomfort, that she had notarized the amendment based on Victor's assurance that I had already signed it and simply couldn't be present given, Complications with a new baby. An explanation Renata pointed out, directly and pointedly, did not satisfy Illinois' legal requirement that a notary witness the actual signing in the signer's physical presence. Priya Ramanathan testified about the $180,000 transfer to Bucktown Hospitality Group, LLC, and its connection to the West Loop property purchase, laying out, methodically, the financial incentive underlying the entire scheme. Not merely a disagreement about operational authority, as Anthony had initially tried to characterize it, but a coordinated effort to redirect a substantial portion of Nana Lucia's capital toward an entirely separate venture that excluded me completely. Anthony testified in his own defense, largely repeating the justification he'd offered me at that coffee shop, framing his actions as an urgent, if procedurally flawed, business decision made under time pressure, rather than a deliberate fraud. Victor's testimony was considerably less sympathetic, and under Renata's cross-examination, he ultimately acknowledged that he had personally suggested using Denise Falco as a notary specifically because he knew she wouldn't ask too many questions. An admission that, once entered into the record, significantly undermined any remaining argument that the entire scheme reflected good faith confusion rather than deliberate, coordinated fraud. The court found in my favor on every substantive claim. The amended operating agreement was voided in its entirety as the product of fraud, restoring the original 50-50 ownership structure between Anthony and me, with Victor's purported 35% interest voided entirely, given that it had been created through the same fraudulent instrument. The court further found that the $180,000 transferred to Bucktown Hospitality Group, LLC, constituted a breach of Anthony's fiduciary duty to me as a co-managing member of Nana Lucia's, ordering the full amount, plus prejudgment interest, returned to the restaurant's operating account, with the West Loop property purchased substantially with those diverted funds. Subject to a constructive trust, in favor of Nana Lucia's LLC, pending final resolution of how that asset would be unwound or credited back to the business. Victor's continued involvement with Nana Lucia's was terminated entirely as part of the ruling, given the court's finding regarding his direct role in both the forgery and the fraudulent fund diversion. I want to be honest that the ruling, while a genuine and significant vindication, did not restore my relationship with my brother to anything resembling what it had been before this entire ordeal. Anthony remained, per the restored operating agreement, my 50-50 business partner in Nana Lucia's, a legal reality Renata, and I discussed at length, weighing whether pursuing a full dissolution of our partnership, difficult and costly as that would be for a business as established and successful as ours, might ultimately be healthier than attempting to continue operating alongside someone who had done what Anthony did. I made the decision, ultimately, working closely with Renata, and eventually, a business mediator both Anthony and I agreed to work with, to remain business partners with Anthony, rather than pursue a full buyout or dissolution. A decision I want to explain honestly, because I think it complicates the tidy, satisfying resolution some viewers of this channel might expect. And I think that complication is important and true to how these situations often actually resolve. Nana Lucia's was, and remains, fundamentally our grandmother's legacy. A business she built with nothing, over 50 years, specifically intending for both her grandchildren to carry forward together. Forcing a full dissolution, however legally justified given everything Anthony had done, would have meant, in practical terms, either selling the restaurant entirely to an outside buyer or taking on debt to buy out Anthony's remaining stake myself, either of which would have fundamentally altered or ended the specific family-built legacy our grandmother had spent her life creating. We restructured instead, with Renata's help and considerable additional legal safeguards. The new operating agreement requires unanimous, written, notarized consent, with both of us physically present together at signing. For any amendment to ownership structure, any transfer of company assets exceeding a modest threshold, and any new business ventures using Nana Lucia's capital or brand. A third, independent managing member, a longtime family friend and semi-retired restaurant industry consultant named Ellen Vasquez, someone both Anthony and I trusted and who our grandmother had known personally for decades, was added specifically to provide ongoing structural oversight and a tie-breaking voice in the event Anthony and I could not reach agreement on a significant decision going forward. I want to be honest that this decision was not, in any sense, about forgiving what Anthony did. I have not forgiven it fully, and I don't know if I ever entirely will. It was, instead, a calculated decision that our grandmother's legacy, and my own genuine investment in the business I'd spent 9 years building, mattered enough to preserve, provided I built in enough structural protection that Anthony would never again have the unaccountable, unilateral opportunity to exploit a moment of my vulnerability the way he had while I was recovering from Sophia's birth. I want to share something my husband, Marco, told me roughly a year after this entire ordeal concluded, because it stayed with me since, and I think it illuminates a piece of this story I hadn't fully processed in the moment. "I noticed something was off with Anthony a few weeks before you found out," Marco told me, sitting on our porch one evening, watching Sophia, by then walking unsteadily around the yard, chase after our dog. "He came by the hospital once, right after Sophia was born, and he seemed distracted, almost nervous, in a way that wasn't like him. I remember thinking it was strange, but I chalked it up to him just being weird about being an uncle, or maybe some stress about running the restaurant alone for a while. I never imagined it was because he'd already started planning something like this." I asked Marco why he'd never mentioned that observation to me at the time. "Because you were in no state to process anything beyond keeping yourself and Sophia okay," he said, honestly. "And because I genuinely didn't have anything specific to point to, just a feeling that something felt slightly off about how he was acting. I didn't want to add worry to everything else you were already carrying, over what might have just been ordinary new uncle awkwardness." Thought about that conversation often, because I think it illustrates something important about how these situations unfold, and about the specific, painful trade-offs involved in protecting someone during an acutely vulnerable period. Marco's instinct to shield me from an unconfirmed, vague suspicion during those exhausting first weeks was reasonable, loving, and, in the moment, probably correct. But it also meant that a small, early warning sign, Anthony's nervous, distracted behavior at the hospital, right around the time, we'd later calculate, he must have already been in active discussions with Victor about the West Loop property, went unexamined for weeks longer than it might have otherwise. I don't blame Marco for that decision. I understand exactly why he made it, and I likely would have made the same call in his position. But I share it because I think it's a useful, honest complication for anyone watching this who is, themselves, currently trying to protect a loved one during a similarly vulnerable period. Sometimes the loving instinct to shield someone from worry, and the protective instinct to flag a genuine, uneasy observation, pull in opposite directions, and there's no perfect, universal answer for how to balance them. What matters, I think, is simply staying attentive enough, as a partner or a close family member, that when a vague feeling does eventually crystallize into something concrete, you're positioned to act quickly rather than losing additional precious weeks to uncertainty. I haven't yet talked about the roughly 40 employees who worked at Nana Lucia's throughout this entire ordeal, and I think their experience matters, because a family business dispute like this doesn't only affect the family members directly involved in the litigation. It ripples outward into the livelihoods of everyone who depends on that business functioning normally. Several of our longtime staff members, people who had worked at Nana Lucia's for a decade or more, some who remembered my grandmother personally from her own years actively running the kitchen, told me, once the dispute became impossible to fully hide from the people working there every day, that they had noticed Anthony and Victor's period of unilateral control feeling different, operationally, in ways that had unsettled them even before they understood the full legal picture. Our longtime head chef, a woman named Carmen de Lacras, who had worked alongside my grandmother for nearly 15 years before eventually taking over the kitchen entirely, told me that Victor had, during that period, begun pushing for menu changes and cost-cutting measures on core ingredients that felt, to her professional judgment, inconsistent with the quality standards my grandmother had insisted on for 50 years. Changes she'd pushed back against, repeatedly, without fully understanding. At the time, the larger financial pressure driving those requests, I kept thinking, this doesn't feel like Anthony's restaurant anymore, Carmen told me, once everything had come to light. It felt like someone else's restaurant that happened to still have our name on the door. I didn't have the full picture, but I knew something had shifted, and I was genuinely relieved when you came back and things started feeling like themselves again. Share Carmen's perspective, because I think it's an important reminder that fraud like Anthony's doesn't happen in a sealed, private vacuum, contained neatly within a legal filing and a courtroom. It ripples outward into the daily experience of everyone connected to the business, sometimes in ways that register, even to people without the full picture, as a kind of intuitive, embodied wrongness. A restaurant that no longer quite feels like itself, run by people making decisions that don't align with the values the place was actually built on. I want to close this story with a specific, ordinary moment, the way I've tried to close each of the stories I've shared on this channel, because I think it's the truest measure of what fights like this are actually for. Sophia's first birthday party was held, at my insistence, in the private event space at Nana Lucia's, the same space I had spent years building and refining, the same restaurant my keycard had once, terrifyingly, flashed red against, now fully, legally, unambiguously mine again, in equal and protected partnership with my brother. Anthony was there. Our relationship remains, I want to be honest, genuinely strained, cordial, functional, businesslike in a way that still carries an undercurrent of grief for the closeness we once had, and that I don't know if we'll ever fully recover. But he was there, at his niece's first birthday, in the restaurant our grandmother built, and at one point during the party, I watched him standing near the old photograph wall, the collection of black and white pictures documenting Nana Lucia's history, our grandmother young and fierce behind the original counter in 1974, watching him study those photographs with an expression I couldn't fully read. "Be so mad at me," he said, quietly, when he noticed me watching him. It was the closest thing to a genuine, unguarded acknowledgement of what he'd done that he'd offered me throughout this entire ordeal. She would, I agreed. But she'd also be glad we're both still standing here, in the place she built, figuring out how to keep it going anyway. I don't know exactly what the future holds for my partnership with Anthony, or whether the careful, structurally reinforced arrangement Renata helped us build will hold, over years and decades, the way our grandmother's simple, trust-based original agreement once did. What I know is that Sophia blew out her first candle that afternoon, surrounded by the same photograph wall, the same worn wooden bar, the same specific, particular warmth my grandmother built with nothing but determination and 50 years of relentless work. Protected now, deliberately and structurally, in a way it wasn't quite protected before, because I refused to let one moment of profound vulnerability become the moment everything my family built quietly slipped away. I want to share something that came to light roughly 8 months after the ruling, because it complicated my understanding of Victor Salcedo's role in this entire scheme, and because I think it's a useful reminder that the person orchestrating a fraud like this is rarely operating for the first time. Renata's investigator, following up on some loose threads related to Victor's business history as part of finalizing the constructive trust arrangement over the West Loop property, discovered that Victor had, roughly 6 years earlier, been involved in a strikingly similar dispute at a different Chicago restaurant, a now-closed establishment in Lincoln Park called Fior, where he had served in a consulting capacity remarkably similar to his role at Nana Lucia's. Before that restaurant's original ownership structure collapsed amid what the surviving owner, a woman named Bianca Torres, had described in a since-settled civil dispute as financial irregularities and unauthorized restructuring, during a period when her own business partner and husband had been managing day-to-day operations largely on his own. I reached out to Bianca, cautiously, once Renata's investigator connected us, and the parallels in her account were, frankly, unsettling. Victor had come in as a consultant promising expertise and capital for an expansion, had cultivated a close relationship with her husband specifically, and had, according to Bianca's account, played a significant behind-the-scenes role in structuring the eventual restructuring of Fior's ownership that ultimately squeezed her out of a business she had co-founded. A dispute that had settled, years earlier, on terms she described as far less than I deserved. Because I didn't have the resources or the stamina to fight it all the way through, the way you apparently did. I don't know, and I want to be honest that I may never fully know, whether Victor operates according to some deliberate, repeated playbook, actively seeking out family or partnership businesses with one member more vulnerable or less engaged in day-to-day oversight than the other, or whether this represents, instead, a pattern of opportunistic behavior that simply tends to recur because Victor is, by disposition, someone drawn toward exactly this kind of ambiguous, exploitable business arrangement. What I do know is that Bianca's account, once shared with Renata, became part of a broader pattern of evidence that made Anthony's continued insistence, throughout much of the litigation, that Victor was simply a well-intentioned business partner who'd gotten a little aggressive with the paperwork considerably harder to sustain. I want to describe, honestly, what the first several months back at Nana Lucia's actually felt like, once the restraining order restored my access and authority, because I think the emotional texture of returning to a place that had, briefly and terrifyingly, been taken from me deserves more attention than a simple statement that I got the restaurant back. Walking back into that kitchen for the first time, roughly 10 days after the restraining order was granted, I remember standing in the doorway for a long moment, Sophia strapped to my chest in a carrier, unable to fully trust that I was actually, legally, permanently welcome there again, despite the court order I had, quite literally, printed out and kept in my bag for weeks afterward, as though some part of me needed the physical reassurance of the paper itself. The staff greeted me with a warmth that, I'll admit, undid me more than I expected. Carmen hugged me for a long moment in the kitchen doorway, murmuring something in Italian I didn't fully catch but understood completely in the tone alone. Several of our longtime servers had, apparently, organized a small, informal welcome-back gesture, a bouquet of flowers waiting on the host's stand, a card signed by nearly the entire staff, expressing, in the specific, unguarded language of people who'd clearly been watching this entire ordeal unfold with real concern for what it meant for the restaurant's future, and for me personally. I found myself, in those first weeks back, developing a specific, somewhat compulsive habit I've only recently, with real effort, begun to soften. Checking every financial report, every vendor invoice, every scheduling decision, with a level of granular scrutiny that went considerably beyond what I'd exercised before any of this happened. Renata, and eventually a therapist I began seeing during that period, gently helped me understand that this hypervigilance, while understandable and, to some degree, genuinely useful given the new operating agreement's requirements, was also, in part, a trauma response, an attempt to compensate, through sheer exhausting attentiveness, for the specific powerlessness I'd felt standing at that back door with my newborn daughter, unable to access a business that was legally, rightfully, half mine. Allowed to build real, structural protections without personally, individually monitoring every single transaction yourself, my therapist told me, during one particularly useful session roughly 4 months into this process. Those are two different things, and conflating them is going to exhaust you in a way that isn't sustainable, and that also isn't actually necessary given the safeguards you and Renata have already built into the new agreement. That distinction between structural protection and personal, exhausting hypervigilance has taken real, ongoing work to internalize, and I want to be honest that I'm still, even now, more than a year later, not entirely there. But I'm closer than I was in those raw, early months back. There's a small, specific detail I want to share, because I think it captures something about what this entire fight was really protecting, beyond the legal and financial questions that dominated most of this story. My grandmother kept a wooden recipe box, handwritten in her own careful script, mostly in Italian with some English annotations added over the decades, containing the original recipes for nearly every core dish on Nonna Lucia's menu, recipes that had never been formally, legally documented anywhere else, existing only in that box, and in the trained, practiced hands of Carmen and the small handful of long-time kitchen staff who'd learned them directly from my grandmother over the years. During the period of Anthony and Victor's unauthorized control, I discovered, once I was back and reviewing what had changed, that Victor had specifically requested Carmen digitize and formally document several of those recipes, ostensibly for operational consistency and staff training purposes, as the catering division expanded. A request that, on its face, sounds reasonable enough, and that Carmen had partially complied with before the restraining order intervened. It was only once Priya's forensic accounting revealed the full scope of the West Loop property purchase, and the separate restaurant concept Anthony and Victor had apparently been planning that I understood, with a specific, particular anger distinct from the broader financial betrayal, exactly what that recipe digitization request had likely actually been for. Building a documented, transferable foundation of my grandmother's original recipes that could be used to stock the menu of an entirely separate restaurant, one built without my knowledge or consent, using not just diverted capital, but potentially the specific, irreplaceable culinary legacy my grandmother had spent 50 years developing. I retrieved that recipe box, physically, and moved it to a safe deposit box at my own bank the same week the restraining order was granted. Not because I believed any further immediate threat existed, but because I understood, in a way I hadn't fully appreciated before this entire ordeal, exactly how many different forms the theft of something precious can take, extending well beyond the more obvious categories of money and legal ownership, stakes into the specific. Irreplaceable knowledge and legacy a founder like my grandmother actually built her entire life's work around. I want to introduce Ellen Vasquez more fully. The independent, third managing member Renata helped bring into the restructured operating agreement, because her ongoing role in the business has become, in the year and a half since the ruling, considerably more meaningful to me than I initially anticipated when we first discussed adding her as a structural safeguard. Ellen had known my grandmother for over 3 decades, having worked, early in her own career, as a young restaurant consultant my grandmother hired in the late 1980s to help modernize Nonna Lucia's kitchen operations, a relationship that evolved, over the following decades, into a genuine friendship that continued right up until my grandmother's death. "Your grandmother used to tell me," Ellen said, during one of our early meetings after she formally joined as the third managing member, "that the hardest part of building something meant to last multiple generations isn't the building. It's making sure the structure around it is strong enough to survive the specific, unpredictable ways people can fail each other, even people who love each other genuinely. She used to say that love is necessary but not sufficient when it comes to protecting something meant to outlast any single relationship within the family building it. Thought about that specific phrase, love is necessary but not sufficient, more than almost anything else anyone said to me throughout this entire ordeal. It captures, more precisely than anything I could have articulated myself, exactly the lesson this fight taught me, that Anthony's love for our grandmother's legacy, and even in some genuine if deeply complicated sense, his love for me, was real and coexisted, somehow, alongside a willingness to forge my signature and divert our shared capital toward a venture that excluded me entirely. Love alone, however real, had never been sufficient protection. It took actual, deliberate legal structure, the kind my grandmother herself had understood the necessity of decades earlier, when she first established our original operating agreement with genuine legal counsel, rather than simply trusting a handshake between siblings. Ellen has become, in the time since, someone I consult regularly, not just as the required third signature on major decisions, but as a genuine mentor and source of institutional memory about my grandmother's original vision for the restaurant. Someone who helps me hold, in a very practical, ongoing way, both the structural vigilance this entire ordeal taught me I needed, and the genuine warmth and generosity that Nana Lucia's was always actually built on. Since this story became more widely known, first through the local business press coverage of the ruling, and later through conversations within Chicago's independent restaurant community, where news like this travels quickly, I've been approached by several other family business owners, mostly siblings or spouses running businesses together, asking for practical advice about protecting themselves against exactly this kind of vulnerability. I want to share, briefly, the specific structural recommendations I now give, because I think they're genuinely useful beyond just my own particular situation. First, ensure your operating agreement requires genuine, verifiable, in-person or reliably authenticated consent, not merely a signature that could theoretically be produced without your direct knowledge, for any amendment to ownership structure or any significant transfer of company assets. Second, if your business partnership involves siblings or close family, seriously consider an independent, trusted third party with real, structural authority, not merely an advisory role, who can serve as a genuine check when the two of you cannot reach agreement, rather than leaving unresolved disputes to fester, or, worse, to be unilaterally resolved by whichever partner happens to have more day-to-day operational access at a given moment. Third, maintain your own independent, periodic access to the business's core financial records, rather than relying entirely on whatever summary reports a partner chooses to share with you, particularly during any period when you anticipate reduced day-to-day involvement. And finally, and I think this is the recommendation that resonates most with the family business owners I've spoken with since, build these protections while your relationship with your business partner is genuinely good, not after you already have specific reason to distrust them. I built my original protection, the simple, trust-based 50-50 structure my grandmother established during a period of complete, unexamined trust in my brother. It took a genuine crisis and a painful, expensive fight to recover from it, to teach me that real protection requires more than trust alone, however deeply and genuinely that trust is felt in the moment you're building your partnership. Epilogue for every woman building something while also building a family. If you're watching this and you co-own a business, hold a significant stake in a family enterprise, or share any meaningful legal or financial partnership with a sibling, a family member, or anyone else, and you are approaching or currently navigating a period of genuine vulnerability, a medical leave, a difficult pregnancy, a health crisis, any stretch of time when your capacity to actively monitor and protect your own interests will be genuinely, understandably diminished, I want to say something directly to you. Build your protections before you need them, not after. A properly structured operating agreement requiring genuine, verifiable, in-person consent for major decisions is not an expression of distrust toward the people you're in business with. It is simply sound practice, the same way a fire extinguisher in your kitchen isn't an expression of distrust toward your own cooking. You hope you never need it. You install it anyway, because the cost of not having it, in the rare moment you do need it, is catastrophically higher than the modest cost of building the protection in the first place. And if you are, right now, in a period of genuine vulnerability, recovering from surgery, navigating a health crisis, caring for a newborn, grieving a loss, and some small, easily dismissible signal suggests that someone you trust might be taking advantage of your reduced capacity to monitor your own affairs, please, do not let exhaustion talk you out of investigating it. I understand, more intimately than I ever wanted to, exactly how difficult it is to summon the energy for that kind of vigilance during the exact period when you have the least energy available to give. But the version of this story where I simply accepted Anthony's vague, evasive explanation and let those weeks pass without ever calling Renata is a version of this story where my grandmother's restaurant and my own rightful share of the business I spent 9 years building would very likely be gone entirely by now. My name is Gabriella Marchetti, and this has been another family hidden fight. If this story reminded you of a business, a partnership, or anything you share with family that deserves stronger protection, share it with them today, and tell us your own story in the comments. It might become a future episode. Subscribe for a new family hidden fight story every week, and we'll see you in the next one.